Hello, everybody. You're really welcome along to our sign language class for today. I am Anthony, and it's really lovely to get to engage with everyone this morning. I hope you've had a good day so far. You may hear, but we're from Belfast, and it's really fantastic today. Unusually, we have blue skies. It's a beautiful sunny day today, and we're at 9 degrees, and it's been a cold week. Temperatures have been a bit low, 6 or 7, and 9 degrees is feeling quite good. So wherever you are in the UK, I really hope that you're enjoying some decent weather. You'll see that there's two of us on screen, myself and the interpreter who's translating what I say from sign language into English. Our topic for today is going to be the culture of deaf people. I'm sure that's interesting for you, and I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about that when I say the words deaf culture. Would you mind putting in the chat, if you could just pop into the chat what you think deaf culture means? I'm going to be talking about it. And in sign language class, usually I teach sign language classes all the time, and I usually do sign language with yourselves. But today I'm just going to give you a little bit of information, which hopefully will be interesting for you. Because it's a really important part of learning sign language that you understand how deaf people behave. Often people come up to us and they say they feel it's different when they're around deaf people. It is, because there is this phenomenon, deaf culture. So it should feel a little bit different, like it does when you go into any culture. And I often get asked, why do people do this? And why do they do that? So I think it's really valuable to have a session where we look at that and we explore the concept of deaf culture. Culture always has an element of history and heritage, understanding where your community has come from. Why has sign language only just come to the fore in recent years? Why is that? Why has the process been so slow for deaf people? We will be exploring that. We'll be exploring the deaf community and why when you meet deaf people, they will be so proud of their language, their culture, their heritage. And you may not realize that, but we are. And then we'll explore what the main differences are between perhaps what you see as mainstream culture and what I see as deaf culture. Let me give you one example. Part of our culture is that we use eye contact as the basis for that. So please use the chat box to ask me any questions that you may have, any comments that you may have. Fire them all in the chat box and we'll answer as we go along. Let's start off by exploring the topic of history. Now, I could talk about that for hours, but I'm not going to keep you beyond the time agreed for today's session. But let me take you back to perhaps the 16th century. And there are records there of sign language being used. It was used in education. And those are some of the earliest records of society in general. But there are records there of deaf people doing quite well in society, having professional level jobs. However, when we get to 1880, we have to deal with a conference that was held in Milan where educators came together and decided to ban sign language, actually ban it being used in education. Just to reinforce, before that, we had the golden age for deaf people. They were involved in society. They were in high-level jobs. However, these professionals got together and made this decision that they thought that people should use speech. And they thought, in their wisdom, that sign language was destroying speech and that they should force deaf children to only use speech and never use sign language. The conference was held in Milan. There were a lot of educators there. And what they did was they brought one deaf person along who did have great oral skills and who could communicate well in speech and lip reading. Obviously, nowadays, in our days, we have technical advances. People can go for audiological tests. They can discover the level of hearing. Some people are profoundly deaf. Some are severely deaf. Some are moderately deaf. Some are hard of hearing. So there are different levels of deafness. I think you probably know that better when you think about vision. Some people have short vision, long vision. It's a complex picture. It's not straightforward, but it would be similar with deafness. There's different levels of hearing or hearing loss. And you can go and get an audiogram done, and that will tell you what type of hearing loss you have. They didn't have those in those days, but what they did was they brought in someone who had fantastic speech and lip reading skills. Now, nobody knows. That person may have been very minimally deaf, but this person was used as the exemplar for how all deaf children needed to be. So a decision was made to ban sign language. And it was easy for the professionals to do that because they didn't use sign language and they didn't understand it. So it was alien to them. So they decided that it shouldn't be used in education. And that philosophy spread from Milan across the world. Obviously, it took a bit of time, but it started in that conference in Italy where people had traveled from all over to go to. So that was in 80. If we think that in the UK, it was around 1883 that the ban was enforced. And from that time, many deaf people who had been in employment started to lose their opportunities because sign language was frowned on. And the knock-on impact of that was for many, many, many years, deaf people started to lose their place in society because sign language was frowned on. They were seen as deaf and dumb. And that is because those were people who couldn't use the speech that was being advocated. And so it was seen that deaf people were failing if they were using sign language. And I don't know if you can imagine what it's like to be a deaf child trying to lip read when you don't know what the words mean, when you haven't heard them, and when a lot is based on sound. Speech is based on sound and hearing. It's not just the words. And deaf children then, how do they manage to work out what's being said when you're guessing what the words are, guessing what's being said? And for deaf children, for many years, their education system focused on trying to get them to lip read and to speak a language that they didn't have access to naturally. This went on for many, many years, and deaf people in society were severely impacted by this because the educational attainment became very low. Even those individuals who were highly intellectual, who had potential, sign language was frowned on. And therefore, communication became a very problematic issue because it was the natural language of deaf people. This went on until the 1970s when academic research was carried out, which demonstrated that sign language actually is highly beneficial for deaf children. And deaf children who learned sign language first went on to have better literacy skills than those who didn't. And the reality is, people wonder, if you teach sign language first, how can you learn to read English? And it's a great question. But the reality is that everyone in life has a different way of communicating. And so, for example, as deaf people, we do live in a visual world and we genuinely do like to see things written down. That's fine. So if you're reading a book and you come across a word that you already know, that's good. But if you're reading a book, or if you're seeing somebody mouthing a word in your lips and you haven't come across that word before, there's no context when you're lip reading at all. And so it is difficult then to know what the context is for that word, and it's just guesswork. You won't realize that because when you're listening to the speech and the sounds around that word. So for deaf children, it is very difficult. And in language learning, we know that a foundation language is crucial. Deaf children all have different levels of hearing loss. And so because we live in a visual world anyway, and sign language is visual, it can be a fantastic foundational language, which then supports the child in their literacy skills because they understand the concepts better. So then, in the late 20th century was the time for advocacy, for pushing for this, for saying that deaf people really can achieve an awful lot. We just need to respect their language. British Sign Language is the one that I'm using. We call it BSL. It was officially recognized by the British government in 2003. That official recognition changed everything. It changed our opportunity for careers, for having advancement in life, and just access to society. It might seem like a small thing, but it was a massive step forward for us. So, for example, When we go to university, we have a right to ensure that there is interpreter provision there. Before that, universities could just say, no, that's far too expensive. We're not going to provide that for you. So now we can see that society is opening up. There are major advances for education generally, and also for access to life. So, for example, when you go to the cinema, as deaf people, we need subtitles. That's really important. And in cinemas nowadays, there are many more subtitled showings so that deaf people can go out and enjoy watching a film as everyone else would. You'll have seen on the news that you have interpreters in vision on the screen or subtitles. So access is something that has really started to open up as society has become more aware and understood a lot more. We also can see in employment and in the workplace, there's a lot more happening now and a lot more openness. If I go to a meeting, if I want to express my own ideas, if I want to know what's going on, I make sure an interpreter comes with me. And so as deaf people, we're not stuck in the bottom rung anymore. We have opportunities for advancement, opportunities for doing all sorts of things because we have access. Interpreting provision is a massive topic for our community because if you think about it, I live in the deaf world, but I engage every day in wider society. And the interpreters become that bridge that enables me to function and just be myself. And I have to say, I have so much respect for interpreters, for the hard work that they do, the training that they have to go through. They come into this job with English as a first language, and they work through the ranks. We have sign language classes, and the qualifications for that are 1 to 6 that they have to go through. And then they have to go through an interpreting course, which could be 2 or 3 years long. The usual qualification route for interpreters takes about 7 years. But it's all about creating access and creating training. Any questions, please fire them in the chat box. I'm really keen to get some questions through from you. I would love to hear what your questions are, what you have to say. So please do that as I continue. Please fire your questions in. So I've been talking about the history of the deaf community, and hopefully that helps you understand why sign language only seems to be emerging now. It's not new. It's always been around, but there were so many negative stereotypes created around it. And unfortunately, those stereotypes have gone deep into society, and many people still see deaf people as these poor people who really don't know very much and have an awfully hard life. And that is due to the history. Oh, we have a different life, yeah, but our bodies are the same. The only thing that's different is we can't hear. There's a question has come in the chat. Lissy, you're asking what the difference is between BSL and SSE. Great question, Lissy. BSL is the abbreviation for British Sign Language. SSE is the abbreviation for Sign Supported English. It really does what it says in the tin. Sign supported English is just using English but throwing the signs on, but keeping the English syntax. Syntax is the order. BSL is actually a language in its own right. Therefore, it has a different syntax and a different order. When we're using English, we're not actually using all of the features of sign language. We're throwing signs in because we're really using speech, but throwing signs in on top of that. So really, you're looking at English. With BSL, because it's a full language, it's much more sophisticated, more complex. It's using a simultaneous approach, so you have facial expression and mouth patterns being used at the same time. And if you can imagine that if you are, just throwing signs in on top, you're only using certain signs if you're using SSE, because you can't, if you're using full English, you can't do 2 languages at the same time. You're throwing the odd sign in. Whereas in BSL, you're making everything is visually motivated. And if everything is visually motivated, it all looks entirely different. It's a great question, though, because it shows what's been happening, that people haven't understood in the past that BSL is actually a full language. SSE isn't. With SSE, you will do things like just watch. This is SSE. So I'm going to sign, this is SSE. Are you ready? I'm going to sign SSE first, And then I'll show you the same sentence in BSL. So hopefully that will show you the difference. So just watch. I'm going to be assigning what is your name. That was SSC. Now I'm going to show you in BSL. Watch. I know it's hard to explain, but with SSE, the first one, there was no facial expression because you're trying to get the words out. When we go into BSL, you will see there's much more fluidity, that it is more sophisticated, that you will see the facial expression and the body language emerging. It's actually the natural form of using it. Lucy, have I answered your question? Has that been clear? I often get asked what the difference is between BSL and Makaton. Makaton is another one that comes up in these conversations. Makaton is a communication system. It is using a few signs selected from part of BSL in a particular region, and it is a system that's designed for people who have a learning disability. So it's a very basic form of communication. And it's great for those people because it's very, very limited. But it's not useful when you're deaf and you've got a brain that can function as fast as everybody else and you want to express yourself and you want to understand what's being said. So those two systems are very, very different. Makaton and BSL. BSL is a language, Makaton is a communication system. Please fire your questions in. It's really helpful to see them coming through in the chat. Another question that I often get asked is whether sign language is the same all over the world. Is it international? And we need to be clear that it really is not at all. So, for example, I live in Northern Ireland. I live in the north. And we have two different sign languages in operation. Of course we do. And each of them are entirely discrete. It's a bit like you learning two different spoken languages. And you know that you can go across the border and you're into another language territory. We're the same in Northern Ireland with two sign languages. So in the south of Ireland, we use ISL, which is Irish Sign Language. So in Northern Ireland, we use both BSL and ISL. You can imagine the history to that. There's a complicated history. And the reason for that is that very often children who lived in the north were educated down south. They were sent to schools down south, which used Irish Sign Language. And other children didn't. They were sent over to England, or they stayed in the north where there used to be BSL, or over in England where there was BSL. So there's a complicated mixture. In Northern Ireland, the majority of deaf people do use BSL. But it is lovely to see that. It is a lovely, rich linguistic environment to be in. If any of you have watched the political announcements that go out from Stormont, where the Northern Ireland government sits, you will actually see two interpreters on screen. One BSL, one ISL. Everybody thinks that's a political thing. It's a religious divide in Northern Ireland. It is not. People do not use language along political lines. It just happens to be where people have been educated. And it's not about being Catholic or Protestant. It isn't. That's not the way it is. These are languages that are used depending on where people live. In America, the sign language used there is called ASL, American Sign Language. So it's nothing to do with English, because if you think about it, we now have BSL, ISL, and ASL, all in countries where the people who aren't deaf are using spoken English, but the deaf community has their own language. And that's fabulous. That's the way language is. It's related to culture. It's a linguistic environment that people grow up in, and they use that one. And everybody always says, but why? Why don't you all have the same language? And my answer is, well, why don't you all have the same spoken language? We grew up in the culture and environment that we live in. That's where we are. We're not going to develop a single spoken language for the entire world. I don't think so. It is also an amazing A beautiful part of deaf culture and deaf heritage that we have so many different sign languages as well. Another cultural point that I think is useful to know. I want you to imagine going into a pub, and if you had two groups, one was deaf and one wasn't, what would the difference be? Obviously, one group would be signing. There would be a different communication method. That's one thing. But there's more than that. Within deaf culture, what you will see operating is that they will all be making very strong eye contact with each other. Those of us who are deaf rely very closely on eye contact. And it's so important. So if you're talking to someone who's deaf and you break eye contact and looked away, we consider that rude. Bear in mind, these are cultures. I understand that in your culture, the opposite may hold, but in our culture, that's what we do. For us, if you are talking to me and you suddenly look away, or you start to drift off and you start looking away, I think you're not interested. You will see hands being used for communication, but also to get attention within sign language. You'll see them waving across a group, and that's just to get someone's attention, much more than you would if you were, because you will shout out somebody's name, we wave to get attention. Or another thing that you'll see is more physical contact, because people are tapping each other to get attention. It could be on the shoulder, on the arm, or wherever, but they are tapping to get attention. You may notice that people start stomping the floor with their feet. And again, that's just to get attention. They're not going to sit there stomping all night, just to tap the foot, because the vibration of the floor goes up through the body and then the person knows to look around. So you will see those differences if you see a group of deaf people together. And that's what we call deaf culture. Sometimes I've heard people saying it seems a bit odd. They think that these are people who have strange behaviors. They're really unusual. Why are they doing that? Please bear in mind, cultures are always different. Every culture has its own expression. So if you see the table being banged to get attention, that's the way it is. I mean, often what we do to get attention is to switch lights on and off in a room. And people never understand that. But can you imagine if you have a crowd of 50 children in a room and I have to go around each child and say to them, look at me and look at me. Another better way of doing that is to switch the lights on and off, and then everybody will look at me because I'm the adult in charge. That's part of what we do, is we use these things to get attention, to get someone's attention, to establish communication. And communication is what this is all about. When I first met my wife, we went through the early processes, and then I started to meet her mum, and I went to her family home. Then we get into my mother. When I first went to meet her mother, she had this lovely, discreet background lighting on. She had gentle table lamps that she set off and music, and my future wife was there with her. So I would go into the living room. It would be this ambient lighting, all quite dark, very gentle lighting, just tiny little lamps. I went to an open door and said hi and said, here, it's dark in here, put a light on. That was the first thing I said, was put a light on. And they were a bit taken aback. Then a visitor would walk in and say, put the lights on. But that's just part of the way that I operate in life. I need to be able to see clearly. And my wife isn't deaf. She is a fluent signer. She does have her level 6, and she does understand deaf culture. So when I did that, she just burst out laughing because she could see the two cultures at play. But my future mother-in-law had a bit of a culture shock because she was left saying, I've set the room up like this. Why are you firing the main light on? And that's what culture shock can be about, isn't it? Another example of deaf culture would be that we are typically very direct. We tend to say what we're thinking or what we're seeing. What I notice in wider culture is there's a lot more trying to please, trying to be nice, not quite get to the point, say things, but not be quite so blunt. And I find that really interesting in terms of the cultural difference. I'm going to move on now to talk about values. The values that we have within our community. What do you think those might be? Obviously, we value our language, sign language. And any country that we travel to, we will respect the sign language being used in that country. There are deaf people who do not use sign language, who use speech and lip reading. They are deaf. And when they do that, their identity is really not deaf. And there's nothing wrong with that. This isn't about a judgment call. People are deaf, but they don't identify as deaf. Those of us who say we are deaf are saying we are part of the deaf community. That's a really positive thing for us. We have that. But you will meet people who don't identify as deaf, and they usually won't call themselves deaf, and they don't use sign language. So this is an identity issue. And it's part of being part of the deaf community that we're proud of our language and proud of who we are. But you will meet people for whom their identity is different. Another value for us is our vision. As deaf people, because we're not hearing, our eyes are everything. I'm a sports person. I'm fanatical about my tennis. And you can imagine that playing sport, my eyes are crucial. And there are people who are both deaf and blind, and those are challenging conditions to put together. For us, communication is all about seeing, using body language, using gesture, pointing. And another part of what we do is point a lot, that you might, even more than you might find comfortable. For example, I am me. You have to point to yourself when you're using sign language, and then you pointing again. He, she, they. So within sign language, our referencing and pronouns are covered by pointing. So we locate people in space and we point to where they are because we are visually motivated. So for example, I live in Belfast and I'm pointing to where Belfast is. For me, it's here. London is over there. Can you see how much pointing is used? So pointing is a very important part of the language. So again, we value the use of that in our hands. For us, another value would be the video phone service. I don't know if any of you have heard of BSL 999. BSL 999 is an app. And it means that deaf people have access to the emergency services through this app. So you can download the app on your phone. All we have to do is hit a button, an interpreter pops up on screen, and they connect through to the emergency services. So police, ambulance, fire, etc. The same as you would do, lift up your phone, hit 999. We now have an app with a VLA. So the interpreter pops up on screen and they communicate with the emergency services. When BSL 999 was launched, that happened in what year do you think? Just this year, 2022, is the first time deaf people have ever had their own access to the emergency services. Up until 2022, if there was an emergency, there was a texting service that you could use, but the problem is not everybody has literacy skills. Bear in mind what I said to you earlier on about the history of the deaf community. Official recognition of sign language was 2003. For many generations, educational attainment has been very low. That's not the deaf person's fault, it's the education system. But if your literacy skills are low, that has a knock-on impact on all sorts of areas of life. And one of those areas would be texting. So a few years ago, we didn't have any of that. And so as deaf people in society, texting wasn't great, to be honest, for an emergency service. But we had to approach someone else, maybe someone in our family. We were always dependent on running to the neighbors, knocking the door and saying, can you help? So can you imagine? I have a family. If my wife had been lying on the floor, I would have had to run to the neighbor's house, leave my wife lying on the floor to go and get the neighbors to phone 999 for me. Now, on my phone, I can hit a button, and in 2022, finally, I can contact the emergency services myself. It's hard for me to explain how important that is in a life or death situation. It's hard for me to express what an impact that makes. We have a company called Sign Video, and they make a lot of the calls for, I live in Northern Ireland, for all health related calls now. We can go through that, another app, Sign Video, and they will also provide the same service. So we're all on the phone nowadays, phoning our dentists or doctors, etc. And now in the past, I used to have to ask someone to do that for me or send an email off and wait until the response came through. Nowadays, I can use this app, and again, an interpreter pops up on screen, and it works the same way as the 999 service works. If I go into a doctor or a dentist and I can't get hold of a face-to-face interpreter in the time scale allocated, I can pop an interpreter on screen, and they can go in with me. And actually, them being on screen gives me much more privacy. If I bring a face-to-face interpreter in, it can be hard to get hold of one within timescales. They're busy people. They have to be booked well in advance. Whereas on this app, I'm guaranteed I'm going to get an interpreter immediately and on demand. Sometimes the only interpreters I can get hold of are going to be female. If it's a man's issue, then I can keep the interpreter on the screen. And even if they're female, they're not seeing as much and it's more contained. Oh, there's so many places we can phone nowadays. We can phone banks, we can phone other places, and it's amazing. And I run my own business. Nowadays, I can make the phone calls that I needed to. My children, if I want to phone their schools, then I can phone them, they can phone me, all via this app. In the past, as the father in my family, I had to ask someone else to make phone calls for me. Now I make my own phone calls. Through this video relay service, it is massively important for us. It has really created access. Adam, thank you for that question. Okay, so the question is, how well do the children deal with having different languages in the house? Lovely question again. My wife isn't deaf, and if I'm not in the house, they probably all chat to each other and use speech. If I'm in the room, they use sign language. Children typically will use sign language if you expose them to it before they speak. Obviously, I'm deaf. I'm using British Sign Language in the house. BSL is the everyday language when I'm there. And so I use sign language, and I always have since I was a baby. Children come to speech later on than they do signs and gestures. That's a natural language process. I actually have a Facebook page, which is entitled Sign Source. And if you look at Sign Source Facebook page, you'll see lots of videos of my children communicating in sign language. There was some research carried out before in Bristol University showing that children from the age of 2 can competently produce the entire fingerspelled alphabet from the age of 2. So children can use sign and gesture before they can develop speech. My children use either speech or sign language depending on who's in the room. When I'm in the room, they sign. If I'm out of the house, they switch to speech. And they do that with their mum. Children don't think about that. It's a natural process for them. If you travel anywhere in Europe, you will see children who have parents. One could be French, one's German. They will communicate with whichever family member is in the room at that time. Children do that naturally without thinking. So thank you for that question. And just going back to talk about values and what's important to us, I've mentioned the video relay service. Interpreters are clearly important for us. And as I am talking to you today, you're hearing the voice of an interpreter who's putting what I'm saying into spoken English for you. And I think that demonstrates the value of interpreters. And nowadays, there is much more understanding of how important that is. If you can imagine going into a medical scenario where there's complex jargon, having an interpreter there ensures that everything is safe and is well communicated. So interpreters also enable us to access education. I'm a graduate, I have a degree, I have a postgraduate degree, and a lot of that, I really appreciate the interpreter involvement, because how could I have done that without having interpreters there? I'm a qualified tennis coach. I wouldn't have got through all my qualifications in coaching without having interpreters there to interpret the courses. As I said, in the past, deaf people didn't have opportunities for promotion. And a lot of the deaf people that I know who are in the older generation have been stuck in manual jobs because they could not get opportunities for promotion. And I am so grateful to them for the work that they did, the very hard work to campaign. They sowed the seeds for the legacy that we've inherited now in society of ensuring that sign language has been officially recognised. Our dream is to have a society where everyone knows some sign language, where everyone can sign. That's the dream, where the two communities don't need to be so separate, where they can merge. And maybe in 50 years or 100 years' time, we'll get there. More questions in? Francis, do I think BSL should be taught in schools? Absolutely. Absolutely it should. Again, my current vision as part of Sign Source is that all children should learn sign language, because deaf people are everywhere. And yes, children at school get to learn other spoken languages, which is really important for them. But when you live in a country, you should access the languages that are near you. There could be a deaf child in the next street to you. There could be a deaf child in the local sports club. There could be a deaf child in your child's school. You could come across them anywhere. Deaf people are human beings who are part of society. We work very, very hard to promote this, and that's part of what my vision is. Okay. In terms of values, another value for us, and one thing that's really important that we value a lot, is subtitling. Yes, interpreters are really helpful, but particularly in times of COVID, when everything was remote, subtitling has been crucial because it's not always possible to get an interpreter. So for example, news. On a leisure activity, when I just want time out, sometimes subtitling is fantastic for all sorts of things. And so, wherever you are nowadays, videos, all sorts of things, when subtitles come up, it's brilliant. I can follow along. I can see what's being said. And without subtitling, there's so much more that I would miss out on in life these days. And honestly, lip reading is hard work, it's guesswork, and it's very difficult to know what to say. So one of our values is also within the deaf community, having a deaf club or events where we come together. It's really lovely to be in an environment where we have a multi-generational approach, children, adults, parents, older people coming together. So the deaf club experience where we can socialize together is fabulous. Meeting people who maybe live a little bit further away from me, having a place they can come and be together. Also, storytelling. I love to hear stories within our community. That's part of our heritage. We now have this app on the phones for the video relay service. And part of that has been people going out and telling each other stories about using it. That's how it's been promoted. Really fantastic to see that. People having opportunities in life. Our community has its own type of humor, and we all think that's really important. Every big culture tells jokes its own way. For us, sporting events are really, I don't know if you know, there's a thing called Deaf Olympics. I've been in 3 Deaf Olympics: Rome, Melbourne, and Taipei. All three Olympic experiences for me were incredible. I got to meet deaf people from all around the world. As an Olympian, I have loved that experience. A really rich, fantastic environment. One of the best experiences of my life was being at those Deaf Olympics and experiencing that Olympic context. We have shared interests, and that's where we come together. Another thing that's really important for us is having visual indicators or other indicators. So for us, that would be, so for example, if you imagine when my children are asleep in bed, if one of them cries, the way I find out they're crying is through a pager which vibrates. It sits on my body and I can feel it. Or if somebody comes to my door, they ring the doorbell, and that's connected to the light system, and my lights flash. For some people, they have their landline connected to the lights as well. So if the phone rings, they know that's going. Smoke detectors connected. So in my house, we have a pager, and the pager can be set up to different wiring systems. So that could be the doorbell, it could be the baby alarm, it could be the smoke detector. And so that's another really important part of us. Oh, there's a few questions here I need to catch up with. So I hope that you found those sets of values or things that we find important helpful. And I want to move on to what some of our belief systems are. As a community, we are really proud of who we are, proud of our identity. We're proud of our language, our culture. It's a very positive expression for us. We just want to promote what we can do, who we are, or what we had to contribute to society. We believe we have a language which is as much value to everyone as any other language. We believe that we are going to live in a society that's just going to become more and more accessible, where more and more will be possible. Hey, time has flown. Any questions, please do fire them in. I'm more than happy to answer anything specific. Sorry if I've gone on a little bit. I've got carried away talking about a subject I'm passionate about. But can I say thank you to everyone for your time this morning, for taking the time to come and learn about deaf culture and a little bit about deaf history. Just to say, in 2 minutes' time, I'll be back doing some sign language classes again, as we've done in the past. And can I wish you all a very wonderful weekend, and I hope the weather is kind to you and you have the blue skies that I'm looking at now. Always the best. Blue skies and a smile on my face. That's the way life is. Have a fantastic weekend at whatever you get up to, and see you all next time in 2 weeks. Thanks to my interpreter for today. And can I also thank the Fritto Village Hall by Royal Voluntary Service for organising this session. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.